What is the minimum amount of assets under management I should have before I start my own RIA? That is today's question on the Transition to RIA question and answer series. It is question number 44. Hi, I'm Brad Wales with Transition to RIA, where I help you understand everything there is to know about why and how to transition to the RIA model. So on today's question, I want to talk about something that I've seen pop up a lot lately, both in articles, online articles. I see blog posts about it. I see people commenting on LinkedIn. I was just asked this same question. I was on a panel on an online conference here this week. And so the question comes up quite a lot, and that is that question of, how big should you be from an asset perspective before you start your own RIA? So maybe before you leave wherever you are now to start your own RIA, or where is it better off apparently to start your own RIA versus tucking into an established RIA? And so I do hear it asked quite a bit, and I wanted to come back and kind of dive a little deeper into it here. So I did do a previous question and answer earlier, and you can go back, find it. I'll link to it in the show notes. That just talked about some of the more kind of basic components to the question. And I'll rehash some of those on this one. Things like what's the regulatory minimum to be able to do it? But the reason I want to expand on it here is because, again, I keep seeing this question come up, and it's frustrating for me to see sometimes how it's being answered. Now, I completely respect different opinions out there, and certainly I'm just one of those opinions. And I think it is good that we have different opinions out there, so folks like yourself can hear different perspectives, different angles, and make decisions for their own. But I also, for reasons I'm going to explain in this video here, I get frustrated sometimes because I think some of the people answering, or the way they're answering, that there's an agenda behind it. And I think it's only fair that if that is the case and you're the one answering in that regard, you need to make that clear to your audience of why you might be answering that. So I want to give you some examples of that here on this question and answer, so you can kind of be aware of it, and then also give you my perspective on this as well to add into that conversation. So again, what I don't like to see, and I've seen this a couple times here just recently, but certainly it's been happening for a while, is where someone will be posed that question, hey, how big should you be before you start your own RIA? And the person gives an answer pretty quick in a particular number. So they'll say, 50 million in assets, or 100 million in assets, or whatever, the 200 million, whatever the case may be. And they give this very definitive answer as if, surely there you go, there we've drawn the line in the sand, and that's absolutely the correct answer. And there's no context necessarily given as to why they are expressing that number is somehow the correct number. And oh gosh, if you're below that, don't even consider it. You need to tuck into an existing firm. And so I wanted to give you, to start with, two examples of where I think you have to be careful based on who's given that answer. And this is not to demean any of the examples I'm going to give, because these are very knowledgeable professionals. But you sometimes have to ask yourself, okay, is there a kind of an agenda behind the scenes of how they might be answering the question? So first example, if you were to reach out to a custodian and talk to someone on that business development team of the custodian, again, I was one of those people once, not demeaning the role at all. Some wonderful people, very knowledgeable, helpful people. But if you were to reach out to them and say, hey, I'm either thinking about starting my own RIA, or I'm thinking about maybe joining one, again, how big should I be before I even consider starting my own RIA? And the thing is, you have to ask yourself, okay, that custodian, most all custodians have some amount of minimums before they will enter into a custodial arrangement with you as an RIA. And some custodians are open to startups, essentially. But most of the bigger players do have some degree of minimums, and sometimes those minimums go, say, as high as 100 million. So let's assume you're talking to a custodian that has a minimum of 100 million. We'll just pick that number, and you have something less than that. You have 70 million. Well, if you're talking to that business development person and you say, well, am I big enough to start my own RIA, or should I tuck into one? Well, their solution that they're out there presenting to you, their custodial option, can only accommodate, or is only willing to accommodate, RIAs that have at least 100 million or could move 100 million to them. So if their answer to you is, oh yeah, go ahead, start your own RA, 70 million or whatever your number is enough, they can no longer help you because they can't, their business model says we won't accommodate a $70 million RA. So guess what? Their response is usually, oh, well, if you're under 100 million, you should probably tuck in, and because there's all kinds of variables, and that's why it's better. Now, perhaps it might be better for you in your particular circumstances at that size and whatever other variables are involved to tuck into an existing RIA. But you do have to question, okay, is the answer because of all those variables, or is it solely because unless I tuck in, I can otherwise not work with you, Custodian, in any capacity? So that's the feedback I'm getting. Now, conversely, because we don't want to pick on just custodians, there are some wonderful RIA platforms out there that would like you to join their firm. Again, a tuck-in into an existing RIA platform. And generally, those folks have minimums as well, just because the economics and the risk that they take on of adding a new advisor needs to make sense. So they say, okay, well, we do have some minimums. But at the end of the day, the business they are in is having advisors tuck into an existing RA, in this case, their own RA. So if you go to them and say, I have 70 million, 100 million, 170 million, whatever the case may be, and say, should I start, am I big enough to start my own RA, or should I tuck into a firm? Well, again, if you think about it, they're in the business of having you tuck into their firm. So what do you think their answer is going to be from, am I big enough to start my own RA, or should I tuck into a firm? Naturally, they're going to probably say, oh, you're not big enough. You should tuck into a firm, and we'd love to tell you about our solution. And so again, you have to come back to who's actually answering the question. Now, as long as that person prefaces it and says, perhaps, okay, no, maybe you are big enough to start your own RA. Here's how that works. Here's what our solution is. Here's why you might choose one over the other. I think that's perfectly fine. But if the answer is just, oh, no, you're not big enough, you should tuck in, and not any more context, again, I think that's an unfair answer to be providing. I even heard a story recently, I didn't hear it firsthand, but that there's an RA out there, apparently their response when asked that question is that if you have less than 1 billion in assets, you should be tucking in, as if anything short of $1 billion, it does not make sense. $1 billion with a B, it does not make sense to have your own RIA. I mean, that's incredible to suggest that anything less than $1 billion cannot make it work. There's some extraordinarily successful RIAs well south of $1 billion. So I think that was the agenda of that RIA, because obviously they wanted people to plug in. Hey, that's their business model. Nothing wrong with that. Some great solutions, but you have to give that context. I think that's only being fair. And so what I equate it to, it's kind of like asking if you go to a parent that has multiple children and ask them, which one's your favorite child? You can't really answer that question, right? That's an impossible question to answer with just, one word answer, the name of whatever that child is. And I'd venture saying 99% of the time you ask parents that, they give that nuanced answer. They say, well, my son excels more in sports. That's where he has an edge. And my daughter maybe does better in academics, or my other daughter is very social, makes friends very easy. And so certainly, if you give that nuanced answer, that's explainable, but it's almost impossible to just give that, oh, just my son, as the answer. And so I think that's the same sort of thing when people ask, how big do I have to be to start my own RIA? Again, it can't be answered in just one single number. And so I did want to just dive into a couple of nuances here of how the different variables that go into this and why it's not such a simple answer. So to just run through a couple of them real quick. So the first is regulatory minimums. Again, I did a whole separate question to answer on this. I'll link to it. But the short of that is you do not have to have any assets to start your own RIA. There's no regulatory minimum to have assets. Some RIAs never have assets because that's not how they charge for their services, or they don't directly manage the assets. They do a fee for service model or something like that. So 0 is the correct answer of how much assets are you required to have to start your own RA. And there is some factors. For instance, once you're above 100 million, you're SEC registered versus state registered. I did a whole question and answer on that as well. So there's some variables there, but nothing that precludes you from a regulatory perspective from starting your own RA. Next up, custodian minimums. I talked about this just a moment ago. Different custodians do have minimums. It depends on what your needs are and what custodian might be a good partner for you. Again, some have minimums. Some go as high as 100 million or more. Some are much lower than that. So again, it factors in, okay, if you want to start your own RIA and you need a particular kind of custodial solution, can you even do that? Are you large enough to do that? Or are you better off in that instance, maybe tucking in and getting that instant scale that RIA has? Next up is the tuck-in minimum. Again, there are some wonderful RIAs out there that would love to have you come join their firm, tuck into their firm, but they too have minimums. So you need to factor in, okay, should I start my own or tuck in? Well, you might love a particular tuck-in solution, but they might have minimums that exceed what you have as well. And some RIAs are, because they're carving out their niche, or have some pretty healthy minimums of where it starts, possibly into the hundreds of millions before it makes sense for them to say, okay, this would be great to have you join our firm. Next up is technology minimum. So part of having your own RIA is building out your own tech stack, as they say. Well, there's pricing and scale that comes with that. So when you go to one of those vendors to establish a new relationship, some of them say, hey, we have a minimum of, and sometimes they express it in assets, other times in number of accounts that you might not exceed, or they don't have a minimum, but the way they price it basically makes it prohibitive for smaller firms. It just doesn't make sense. And so if you want to access their solutions, you're probably better off tucking into a firm that already has that bigger scale that can instantly provide you with that access to those solutions. Also a thing, and much more nuanced, I've done a bunch of questions, answers on this, so I can't fully answer it here, but is that question of profitability. How big do I have to be to make it a profitable RIA, to make it a successful RIA? And again, there's no simple answer to that. There are some extraordinarily successful and profitable sub $100 million RIAs that run a very lean operation, sometimes solo practices, literally one person, not even support staff. And then there are others that, both smaller and larger, and however you want to define that are less profitable because they provide more services, have a higher cost structure. So it runs the full gamut. There's no simple answer. So if you were to say, oh, what does it take to have a profitable RIA? How big do I have to be? And someone just gives you an answer, that it cannot be that simplified. You have to dive into, well, what do you plan on offering as part of your service and your value proposition? And what's it going to cost to either build that out yourself or essentially outsource that if you tuck into a firm to supply those needed services? So again, not a simple answer on profitability. And then the last one is there ever a time that you are too big to tuck into a firm? Like, do you think, okay, once I get to 500 million, should I not even consider tucking into a firm? And I would tell you that's not the case at all. Now, while having 500 million certainly makes having your own RIA perhaps more accessible for all the reasons I talked about, you've reached minimums with custodians, technology providers. There are some wonderful tuck-in solutions, and there are many examples of very large advisors and teams that have considered their options, and they tuck into these firms because they say, hey, what these firms can provide me is either better than I can create on my own, or I don't want to be responsible for having to build some of that out, and I'd rather just partner with them and have them provide it for me. So there is no kind of maximum either where you should, oh gosh, once you're above a certain number, you should never consider tucking in. You should only start your own. Don't let anyone tell you that either, because then it comes down to what is important to you individually, the services you want to provide, how you want to run your practice, and then what are the best solutions available to you and that you would want to consider using. So the main takeaway, there is no simple answer. If you see that question posed and someone gives a finite, quick, draws a line in the sand answer, for what it's worth, I'm not a fan of that. I don't think that's fair to say. I don't even answer it. I won't even give a number if called upon it, because I just think it's, and whether people want to say that's dodging the question, I'll take that, because it's just, there's too many variables that are specific to each individual advisor and team that have to be addressed before you can try to give that kind of guidance. So I just caution you, careful with hearing that answer provided. Ask yourself, who is answering the question for you? Is there I don't want to say an agenda behind it, but are there limitations that they have, whether it's that custodian that can't otherwise help you unless they convince you to tuck in, Or is it that RIA that wants you to join their firm, so they're going to guide you towards that solution? Again, consider who's answering the question. Lots of variables in total involved in this. So like I said, my name is Brad Wales, and I am with Transition to RIA, and this is the sort of thing I help advisors with all day long, is answering these sorts of questions. You know, how does the RIA model work? How does a tuck-in work? What are the minimums required of all these different solutions? Why might I choose one option over another option? So happy to help you with that as well. If you're not already there, head on over to transitiontoria.com. That's my website. Lots of videos, podcasts, white papers, all kinds of information you can easily access to learn more about the RIA model. And then the best thing to do, and it's right at the top of the webpage and the body of the page as well, is just a contact link. Click on that. You can instantly and easily schedule a time to have a one-on-one conversation with me about this very subject. Because again, at the end of the day, it really comes down to your specific practice. While I try to provide a lot of information on these videos and podcasts, I can only do this because with a general audience on a more macro level. The reality is it's important to get down into those micro details. So happy to do that with you. Jump on over to the website, transitiontoria.com. If you're listening to this on podcast, would love you to review the podcast. Very much appreciate that. With that, I hope you found value on today's question, and I'll see you on the next one.